them. The bodies were already frozen by the time the relief party reached them. That detail matters, because it means what those soldiers found on the morning of December 22nd, 1866, scattered across 5 acres of Wyoming hillside, had been locked in place by the cold overnight. Preserved. Undeniable. Every wound, every mark, every deliberate act committed on those men after the fighting stopped had been sealed into the earth like evidence. And yet, within days, the official record would describe something else entirely. That is what this story is actually about. Not the ambush, not the numbers, not the battle itself, which lasted perhaps 40 minutes and ended with 81 men dead. What this story is about is what happened afterward, in the hours and days that followed, when the living had to decide what the dead were allowed to tell. Because someone made a decision, a calculated, deliberate decision, and that decision shaped what America was told, and what America believed about what happened at Lodge Trail Ridge for generations. Start with the silence. December 21st, 1866, mid-afternoon. The soldiers left at Fort Phil Kearny had been listening to gunfire beyond the ridge for nearly 40 minutes. Not continuous. There were pauses, volleys, the distant crack of rifles, and the lower percussion of something harder to identify. The men on the walls said later that it rose in intensity, then scattered, then thinned to almost nothing, and then it stopped. Not in the way battles stop when one side withdraws. It stopped completely. The kind of silence that does not invite hope. The commander at the fort, Colonel Henry Carrington, sent a small scouting party. They turned back before reaching the ridge. The number of warriors they glimpsed in the fading light was enough. Carrington was not a coward. He was a man doing the arithmetic of survival and not liking the hour. He waited until morning. That waiting, those hours between the silence and the discovery, is worth sitting with for a moment, because Carrington knew, not in detail, but in the way commanders know things when 40-minute battles go completely quiet. He spent that night inside the fort with a certainty he could not yet put on paper. By dawn, he could. The relief party that rode out on December 22nd was led by Captain Ten Eyck. He had more than 50 men with him, artillery support, and, according to several accounts, a clear reluctance shared by every man in the column. They moved through wind-driven snow. The temperature had not risen above 0. When they reached the top of the ridge, they looked down into the valley. They stopped immediately. The accounts of what they saw come from several sources: soldiers' letters, surgeons' notes, testimony filed weeks later in military inquiries. They are not consistent in every detail, but they are consistent in the one detail that matters. Not one man who was part of that recovery party described the scene the way it would later appear in the official report filed to Washington. What they found was not 81 battlefield casualties. What they found was something the U.S. Army had no existing category for. Now, before the aftermath can make sense, you need to understand the 24 hours that preceded it. Not Fetterman's biography, not his Civil War record, just what he did on the morning of December 21st, and why. Carrington's orders were written down. That is not in dispute. Do not pursue beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Those orders existed because Carrington had been watching Lakota and Cheyenne warriors use a specific tactic for weeks, drawing small parties out from the fort with a visible skirmish, retreating just fast enough to keep them moving, pulling them away from support and into terrain where numbers and position meant everything. It was a rehearsed strategy, and it had been used repeatedly, just never at this scale. Fetterman knew about the tactic. He had been briefed. He chose to disregard it, not out of ignorance, but out of a particular kind of confidence that Civil War veterans sometimes carried into the Plains Wars. The belief that native warriors, however fierce, would not hold ground against disciplined American troops in a direct engagement. That belief was not unusual. It was institutional. It ran up and down the command structure of the frontier army. It was also catastrophically wrong. When the decoy party appeared, a small group of warriors riding just close enough to provoke, just far enough to lead, Fetterman took the bait with both hands. He pursued. He crossed the ridge. And on the other side, between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors, positioned in draws and behind rock formations and lying flat in the frozen grass, were waiting. The cavalry and infantry had separated during the pursuit. That separation likely decided the outcome before a shot was fired. The cavalry was hit first, overwhelmed in minutes. The infantry pulled to a rocky outcropping and made a last stand. Some of them died firing. Some of them ran out of ammunition. A few, based on the wounds later examined by the post surgeon, died by their own hand in the final moments rather than face what was coming. 40 minutes, possibly less, then silence. Now back to that hillside, back to the recovery party, and back to what they were looking at. The 81 men had not simply been killed. In the tradition of Plains warrior culture, the battle had continued after the last shot was fired, not as cruelty for its own sake, but as ceremony, as communication. The mutilation of a fallen enemy carried specific meaning within Lakota and Cheyenne warrior tradition. It was not random. It was intentional, practiced, and from within the culture that carried it out, deliberate in its message. Eyes had been removed, ears had been cut away, limbs had been severed, skulls had been opened, tendons had been cut at the heel and wrist. The bodies of several men bore dozens of arrows, some driven into the frozen ground through the bodies themselves, pinning them to the earth as a final statement of dominance. Captain Fetterman and Captain Frederick Brown were found apart from the others, with wounds suggesting they had died by their own hands. Even in those final moments, the story refused simplicity. The post-surgeon, Dr. C.M. Hines, examined every body. He catalogued what he found. His private report, detailed, clinical, thorough, was classified almost immediately. The specific findings in that report were not included in the documents forwarded to Washington. What reached the War Department described a military defeat. What Hines wrote described something the military did not want described. The message left on that hillside by the warriors who won that battle was not meant for the American public. It was meant for the soldiers who would come after, a visceral, unambiguous declaration about what it meant to enter this land as an occupying force. The warriors understood exactly what they were communicating, and to whom. But that message, and its deliberate nature, was precisely what Carrington's official report could not afford to transmit accurately. Here is where the cover-up takes shape. Colonel Carrington was not an incompetent man. He was, in many ways, the wrong man in an impossible position. Sent to garrison a fort on treaty-protected land, given insufficient troops to do it safely, ignored when he requested reinforcements, and then placed in the same chain of command as officers who openly contradicted his orders. He had documented his concerns. He had sent reports. He had been, by his own account, and by much of the surviving evidence, the cautious voice in a situation that required caution. And then Fetterman crossed the ridge, and Carrington was left holding the consequence. He had several audiences to manage simultaneously. Washington needed a report. The army needed an explanation. The press, already covering Red Cloud's war with increasing alarm, needed a narrative. The families of 81 dead men needed something, some version of events that gave their sons and husbands a death worth mourning. The full truth served none of these audiences. Think about the arithmetic of the moment. The Civil War had been over for less than 2 years. The country had just finished burying hundreds of thousands of men. Public tolerance for military casualties was at its absolute floor. Recruitment for frontier postings was already difficult. If the complete details of what the Fetterman Relief Party found, the specific catalogued clinical details in Hines' private report, had reached the newspapers, the pressure to abandon the Bozeman Trail forts would have been immediate and overwhelming. More importantly, and this is the part the official record was most careful to obscure, the disaster did not happen in spite of the command structure. It happened because of it. Fetterman disobeyed direct orders. That fact appeared in the official documents, but softened. What did not appear with equal clarity was the institutional arrogance that produced Fetterman, the widespread belief at every level of the frontier army that Plains warriors were a manageable problem, that the Bozeman Trail was worth the cost, that the warnings of experienced scouts and frontiersmen were less reliable than the confidence of decorated officers. The cover-up was not only about the condition of the bodies. It was about accountability for a strategy that had failed completely. Carrington was relieved of command within weeks. The phrasing was quiet. No court-martial, no formal charges. He was simply moved, reassigned, sidelined, made to disappear from the story with the bureaucratic efficiency that large institutions use when they want a problem to stop being visible. The subsequent military inquiry focused intensely on Carrington's conduct at the fort, his preparations, his orders, his decisions, while spending considerably less time on the generals above him, who had denied his requests for additional troops and ammunition for months. The inquiry was not a search for truth. It was a search for a place to put the blame that left the institution largely intact. What the inquiry also avoided examining closely was the testimony of the men who had been on that recovery party. Captain Ten Eyck filed his own account. Several enlisted men wrote privately to family members describing what they had seen on that hillside. Those letters, in the months that followed, circulated quietly among families in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, the states that had sent the most men to the frontier postings. The Army could not suppress private correspondence, but it could ensure that those accounts never made it into the official narrative, never appeared in the congressional record, never formed the basis of any formal inquiry into conditions at Fort Kearny. The men who had walked that hillside and loaded those bodies onto wagons carried what they had seen without any institutional acknowledgement of what it had cost them. There was no language for it in the Army of 1866, no provision for it. They were expected to file back through the fort gates, resume their duties, and say nothing beyond what the official report permitted. Several of them never spoke publicly about December 22nd for the rest of their lives. Others who did speak found their accounts dismissed, minimized, or simply ignored by the historians who shaped the early record of the Plains Wars. The soldiers who survived the aftermath of the Fetterman Massacre were, in their own way, as erased from the official story as the details of what they found. Carrington spent decades afterward fighting that record. He wrote, he testified, he corresponded with historians and journalists and anyone who would listen. His second wife, Frances, eventually published a detailed account drawing on his notes and on the testimony of survivors. The book was careful, documented, and largely accurate. It made almost no difference in his lifetime to the official version. He died in 1912. He had been trying to correct the record for 46 years. Fort Kearny itself was abandoned in 1868, not framed as a consequence of the massacre, but as a provision of the Fort Laramie Treaty signed that year. Red Cloud had fought a sustained, disciplined campaign across nearly 2 years. He had closed the Bozeman Trail through attrition and relentless pressure. The United States government concluded the corridor was not worth the cost of holding it. The forts along the trail were evacuated. The troops withdrew, and within hours of the last soldiers leaving, the structures were burned to the ground by the warriors who had spent 2 years fighting to see exactly that outcome. Red Cloud won, completely, unambiguously. It remains one of the very few instances in the long history of American Western expansion where the federal government negotiated a treaty on terms that amounted to a genuine military concession, acknowledging, however carefully the language was phrased, that it had been defeated in the field and forced to withdraw. That victory did not begin at the treaty table. It began at Lodge Trail Ridge on December 21, 1866, when a strategy of disciplined patience and tactical precision destroyed an 81-man column in 40 minutes and demonstrated, in a way that could not be ignored at the highest levels of the War Department, that the cost of holding the Bozeman Trail was going to be higher than anyone in Washington had anticipated. The massacre was not the war's conclusion. It was the moment the war's outcome became legible to the people making decisions about whether to continue it. The battle lasted 40 minutes. The consequences of that 40 minutes rippled outward for years, into congressional hearings, into appropriations debates, into the fundamental strategic question of whether the U.S. Army could garrison and hold the northern plains against a sustained organized resistance. The Fetterman Massacre did not end that debate, but it shifted its terms permanently, and the sanitized record, the ledger that described a military defeat without describing what the relief party actually found, without including the surgeon's full findings, without naming the institutional failures that made the disaster inevitable. That record served its purpose. It kept the story manageable. It kept careers intact. It kept recruitment from collapsing entirely in the short term. But it also meant that the men who set the conditions for the massacre, the generals who denied reinforcement requests, the strategist who insisted the Bozeman Trail was defensible, the institutional culture that produced officers like Fetterman and rewarded exactly the kind of confidence that got 81 men killed. None of them were ever made to fully account for what their decisions had cost. 81 men died on a Wyoming hillside in December 1866. Their names are documented. Their unit assignments are documented. In many cases, their letters home, written in the weeks before the ambush, still exist in family collections and regimental archives. They were real people who walked into a situation that their commanders, their generals, and their government had failed to prepare them for honestly. What happened to their bodies was documented too, in private, by a surgeon who did his job with precision and without flinching. That documentation was classified. The families received something else. The public received something else. The historical record, for decades, reflected something else. The warriors who fought that battle were communicating something specific and intentional. The decision to erase that communication from the official account was equally specific and intentional, serving not the dead and not the historical record, but the living institution that needed to keep functioning, keep recruiting, and keep projecting an image of competence and control it had not earned on that particular ridge on that particular December afternoon. That is the pattern worth carrying out of this story. Not the arrogance of one captain, not the tactical brilliance of one battle, but the persistent institutional impulse, visible across American military history in this period and well beyond it, to manage the record in ways that protect structures and careers over truth, to decide from a position of power what the public is ready to hear, what the families deserve to know, and what the history books should say. Every official record is a choice. Every archive reflects not only what happened, but what the people in power decided to preserve and what they decided to leave out. Lodge Trail Ridge is still there. The wind still crosses it in December the way it did in 1866. The historical marker is modest. The ground holds nothing visible of what it witnessed. But consider this. Carrington's sanitized report is still the document most cited in early accounts of the Fetterman Massacre. Hines' full surgical findings have never been fully published. The private letters of the men who walked that hillside on December 22nd remain scattered across family archives, largely uncollected, largely unread. The congressional testimony that might have named the generals responsible for under-resourcing Fort Phil Kearny was never compelled. The question worth asking and carrying with you after this is not only what was erased from Fort Phil Kearny's records, it is how many other ledgers, in how many other conflicts, were closed with the same quiet efficiency. How many other surgeons filed reports that were classified before morning? How many other recovery parties came home and were told, in the particular language institutions use for these things, that what they had seen was not what they had seen, and how much of what we call history is, in the end, simply the version that someone in power found survivable.